All right. Thanks again for joining us. Today, we're going to be talking about legacy planning and multi-generational planning. And a lot of times, when we think about estate planning, people say, well, I need to have a very large estate. I need to have millions of dollars or a mansion or, horses and a Ferrari and everything else, right? Before I do my estate planning, because they imagine that the word estate sounds very intimidating, right? And they imagine that you have to have a lot in order to do your estate plan or for it to be important. The reality is that estate planning is important for everybody. And no matter what situation you're in, what background you have, it's important to have some basic documents in place to anticipate emergencies that might come up and to be able to plan around those sort of needs. But it's also important when you want to leave something for the next generation, right? When we look at the statistics for multi-generational poverty and for kind of the cycle of poverty that happens, especially in minority communities, a lot of it is because there's no transfer of wealth from generation to generation, right? And if you look at some of the most powerful families in the country, historically, the way that they've maintained their power is by passing on not just wealth, but also values and strategies to be able to use that wealth from generation to generation to generation, right? And they say that most of us, every family has somebody who breaks the mold, and at some point they have luck that comes their way, right? And if you have over your lifetime, you have maybe $1 million that passes through your hands. The question is, what do you do with that? But every once in a while, somebody within the family may have a big break, and they may have millions and millions, or hundreds of millions pass through their hands. And the question is, if they put proper structures in place, that could change the future of their family legacy forever. So that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today, right? So why estate planning? Why is this important? For the average person, the single biggest benefit that somebody gets from estate planning or from the estate planning process is planning for the risk of, emergencies, incapacity, somebody dying, that sort of thing, right? And making sure that there's clarity, making sure that the process is going to be, followed without any problems, that who's going to actually be able to step in and be able to manage things on your behalf, and so on and so forth. That's the single biggest benefit that most people get from the process, because it's predictability, right? And it avoids family stress and conflicts and so on. The second thing is, and especially in today's world, depending on what state you're in, probate can be very expensive. So when somebody dies, that process of going through the court system to transfer assets can be expensive. It can take a long time. It can cause family problems very easily, right? And so most people want to avoid it. It's a public process. And so that's the second biggest benefit that most people get from their estate planning. So if you have a will, if you have a trust, if you have your powers of attorney and so on, chances are, if it was done properly, it's going to help you avoid having to go through the court system. The third benefit is asset protection. When somebody has the risk of lawsuits or creditor issues or so on, we want to make sure that that's protected. And when you leave your assets to the next generation, we want to protect it from, potential issues that they may have with creditors or with lawsuits or whatnot, right? And so protecting it for the next generation, that's part of the asset protection. And then we come to what we call legacy building. And legacy building is, again, when you pass something on, we want to make sure that that can then maximize the potential value to your family after you're gone, and put them in a better situation than you were put in, maybe, or give them the opportunities, the step up in life, right? So that they can be able to be in a better spot in the future as well. They have more chances of success because you stack the cards in their favor, right? And then finally, tax avoidance. And so once you do have a large estate, then that estate may be subject to estate taxes, and estate taxes are very high. In fact, they're looking at changing the limits of exemptions for estate taxes. Right now, they're at 11.25 million. They're probably going to be changing very soon to 3.5 million. And the problem with estate taxes, it's not a problem if you don't worry about it during your lifetime, But a lot of times we think this is just affecting the rich. Well, it is affecting the rich, but it also affects our ability to become rich, right? So if we want to leave assets for the next generation, anything above that limit is going to be taxed at close to a 50% tax rate. So right off the top, the government takes half of the inheritance that you would leave to your family, right? And so proper planning can help avoid that. And so a lot of times we think that estate planning is very simple and everybody gets the same thing. But estate planning is very situation specific, and every family is different. And because every family is different, every estate is different. And so here's an example of that. Imagine two scenarios, right? First scenario, and they look almost exactly the same if we look at just this first part, right? First scenario, single mom, she has two kids under age 10, she owns a home, and her net worth is around 70,000, right? Have a picture in your head of what that might look like, right? The second scenario, single mom, two children at home under age 10, they own a home, their net worth is around 70,000. Same scenario on paper. Assets look the same. Most of the time, an advisor would sit down, they would say, well, it's the same situation, same estate plan, right? But the reality is that the situational differences are what affects the type of planning that you want to have. So in the first scenario, single mom, why is she a single mom? Because she's a widow. Her husband passed away while on tour, right? The children were too young to be able to remember him very much. And then the rest of the family is very supportive. So, when she needs babysitting, when she needs assistance, whatever, the rest of the family's there for her, right? So that's scenario number one. Scenario number two, instead, the ex-husband, right? It was a divorce. Ex-husband was an alcoholic. He left the family because he was having an affair. She has sole custody of the children. The children are afraid of dad because when they knew him, he was an alcoholic, right? And there aren't any other supportive family members. Now we look at their estate plan and we say, are these the exact same estate plans? Should they be? Very different situations, right? So if we look at scenario one, what is this family going to be most concerned with? They're going to be very concerned with making sure that they leave memories and pictures and so on of their dad, right? He was a war hero. He passed away in battle, right? And the kids were too young to remember him, but that's part of the legacy that you want to leave. You want them to be able to remember him, right? And then in the planning, you're going to have, the family involved to step in as guardians and so on and so forth. And there's probably going to be, maybe other assets that are left from grandparents or from aunts and uncles or whatever to help take care of these kids. In the second scenario, the estate plan would be very different, right? One of the big concerns for this mom would be, well, if I die, I don't want my kids going to my ex because he's not a good parent, right? So we need to address that in the estate plan. Maybe we look at the situation and we say, okay, well, there aren't really any family members. And so there would be no natural guardians who could step in and be able to take care of the kids. So we need to designate a guardian, and then we need to provide assets to be able to take care of the children. Maybe we do that through life insurance, because otherwise there's nobody that's going to step in and provide that support naturally, right? And then remembering parents might not be as big of a concern in the second scenario, but it would be very concerning if ex-husband gets control of all the money. So we need to make sure that we protect the assets from ex-husband's control, right? So the estate planning that would be done for each of these is very different, even though on its face the scenario looks exactly the same. And so so that's one of the things that I think is very important when we get to legacy planning or multi-generational planning. It's not just about the assets. It's not just about the stuff. If you want to leave a legacy of money, of wealth, it's very easy to do that. You just get the biggest life insurance that you can possibly afford. You leverage the money that's going to come from the insurance company, right? And then you pay a small amount in premiums to be able to leverage all those dollars when you pass away. It's an easy way to leave a lot of wealth. But it's not enough to just leave the wealth, because if you leave the wealth, and it's misspent, right? The average inheritance lasts less than 7 months. Imagine that. You leave $100,000 or $100 million, and that's supposed to take care of your family for the rest of their lives. If it's spent in less than 7 months, it's not going to accomplish its purpose. And so we want to make sure that the plan that you put in place is addressing the actual needs, right? And that's part of what we call legacy planning. So how do we actually make sure that that money is going to last? Well, you have to transfer along with the wealth, you have to transfer values, because the values that go along with the wealth will inform and help whoever you're leaving it to actually use it properly, to use it for its intended purpose, right? To be able to accomplish the goals that you have for the family or for your legacy. And so we have a recipe to be able to do that. And the recipe consists of 3 parts. Number 1 is you need to have written guidelines on what you want to have happen, what's important to you, and what should be followed, right? Number 2, you need to have value statements, and we could also call them expressions of love, right? But value statements that say, these are things that are important to me. Here's why I'm leaving this to you, right? Here's what I expect. Here's what the statements of what your values are. And then finally, leaving your story, because your story is what informs the rest of it, right? Nobody's going to adopt your values simply because they know what you value. They're going to adopt your value because they know why you value it. And when you leave your story, it's what informs the why of why you're doing this. So we'll talk through each of these. So the first one, establishing guidelines in your documents. When we set up a plan, whether it's a trust or a will or whatever estate planning that we're putting in place, we want to leave the instructions of what you want to have happen when you're gone, because you won't be there to be able to provide those instructions, right? And so whatever instructions we want to have that are guidelines that should be followed, they can either be controlling language that has to be followed, or they can be persuasive language that basically is suggestions, and somebody that respects you would likely follow it, but they legally don't have to, right? And depending on how we do it, will determine what the likelihood is that that plan is followed through with. And so, one of the most important things is that we need to address your specific family issues, your specific family relationships, and matters and so on that you know about already in your planning. Because if we don't address those, they can come back to haunt you, and they can undermine the planning, right? So for example, if you have somebody in the family that's not good with money and you leave them money, what's going to happen there? Well, they're going to misspend it, right? Or if you have somebody in the family that has a drug problem or an alcohol problem and you leave them money, where's the money going to go? Well, it's going to go to their addiction, right? And so if those things are foreseeable, then we want to address those proactively in the planning. We want to make sure that that's not going to happen. The second thing is we use something called common trusts, especially if you have young children. So, all my kids are under 8. The oldest one just turned 8. We have 5 kids at home. So if I want to leave, wealth to my family, if I just leave it to them outright, free of trust, right? Or if I have it split equally in equal shares, what's going to happen is I pass away, and then it's going to be split into 5 shares. And the house is split in 5 shares. The savings, the life insurance money, all of it's split into shares. And then whoever the trustee is or whoever the guardian is, the custodian for the money, they're going to then manage those shares for each of the children. And they're going to try to do their best to keep it equal, right? Keep it fair. But my kids are still young. They still need to be raised. Somebody's going to have to provide them with a home and with living and so on and so forth. And so I would prefer for the house not to be sold until they turn 18, right? Or until they're older. I'd prefer that the money be used to prioritize the younger children while they're still underage. And when the older children, become adults, they don't need as much help as the younger children. So I'd prefer for, the priority to be given to those that are still, underage, that still need to be raised. We use what's called a common trust to do that. And so we keep everything together. Instead of dividing it out in shares, we keep it all together until a certain point is reached. So when the youngest one turns 18, then it will be divided into equal shares and get distributed, right? So that's a very common method to be able to keep that wealth concentrated to do more for the family while they still need it, and especially while the children are still young. You can also decide, okay, well, I want to make sure that I put somebody in charge of managing this stuff, but I don't want to just have one person in charge because maybe they're good making decisions by themselves, but maybe you don't trust them 100%, or maybe they're not the best person with money, but they are the best person to take care of the kids and to manage the household. Uh, so you can put more than one person in place and put co-trustees, or put multiple people with checks and balances to kind of make sure that the plan is going to be followed properly, right? We talked about spendthrift planning, of protecting beneficiaries from themselves, because if they have a problem or if they would use the money improperly, we want to protect their inheritance from themselves, even so that they don't just misspend it, right? And then we get to a very interesting aspect of planning, which is dynasty planning. If you want to leave something from generation to generation to generation, there are ways to be able to set that up so that it doesn't just go away and get all used up within one person's lifetime. So if I leave it to the kids and they all get in equal shares and then they spend it during their lifetime, then it's all gone. But if I left a good amount of wealth, maybe I want that to benefit my grandchildren. Maybe I want it to benefit my great grandchildren, right? Maybe I want specific assets that I have to be kept in the family. So we have a client of ours, for example, that has a family cabin, and they want the family cabin to stay in the family. So they want, they don't want it sold. They want it to continue from generation to generation, so that the family can always use it, right? And that's what we call a dynasty trust, is setting up that structure so that whether there's specific assets or whether that's accumulation of wealth that can benefit your posterity basically forever, right? And we have it continue as long as it possibly can. And that can also be the same case with charitable planning. So you can actually, through for charitable purposes, you can have quite a bit of control on how that is going to happen, and how involved your family is in the giving process, right? And that's also a method to be able to, provide a legacy, show what's valuable or what's important to you, is leaving money towards charitable causes and having your family be involved in that giving process. Even if you're gone, they continue with that giving process. And so, let me share another story with you. I had a great aunt and uncle, and they were great, but also they were great uncle and great aunt, right? They didn't have any kids, and they didn't have anybody that they wanted to leave their inheritance to. And so, they lived a fairly modest life, middle income, sort of situation, and they never really earned a ton of money in their lives, but they did want to leave as much as possible to their church when they passed away. So what would they do? Well, they would save up money, and then as soon as they had enough money saved up, they would buy a paid up life insurance policy and maximize the death benefit they could get on it. And then they put their church as the beneficiary on it. And they did that 5 or 6 times before they passed away. When they died, when they both passed away, they left $15 million to their church. That's a very large legacy, large inheritance, right? That they were able to leave. But they never earned that much money. They leveraged the life insurance money to be able to leave that charity, that much value. And so sometimes we imagine, well, we can't make that big of a difference. We don't have that much money. It depends on what's important to you. If leaving value is important when you pass away, there are ways to do that, right? And a proper plan can help you to structure that. So number one, establishing guidelines in your documents, and those guidelines will then be followed when you're gone, because you won't have a voice anymore. Your guidelines are going to have to be your voice, right? The second part is leaving expressions of values, because again, it's not enough to just leave the money and even just leave the instructions, because sometimes that's not respected, and they don't understand why you did that. So people will actually take offense if they're supposed to be the ones, in their mind at least, that's going to inherit everything, and then you leave it to charity and they're like, what the heck? Well, I guess grandma didn't love me, right? But that's not how it works. You have to leave the explanation. The explanation is these statements of values, right? And so So for example, letters to your loved ones. When you're gone, leaving a letter that would explain, you know, how you feel about them, what your intentions are, and so on and so forth. There's something called an ethical will, which is actually not a legal document. It's just a document. It's an expression of your values, but it's a method for you to be able to say, these are things that are important to me. Hard work, right? Resiliency, equality, whatever it is, whatever your core values are, that leave those expressions of, statements of those values, but also leave, you know, basically your words so that your family can then reflect on them and understand why you're leaving the instructions that you're leaving. Sometimes you can even leave within your guidelines. You can leave instructions and messages in the way things are supposed to be done, right? So, for example, we have one of the attorneys in our firm, and she was always confused because her grandfather um, would take all the grandkids out to 7-Eleven for like a grandpa grandkids date sort of idea, right? And one day there was one of the grandkids who had acted up, that wasn't, he wasn't being good, and so she told him that he wasn't going to be able to go with grandpa to 7-Eleven as his punishment, right? But grandpa says, no, no, he gets to come anyway. I don't care what he's done. Nothing gets in the way of going to 7-Eleven, right? And she's like, well, why? What, like, I don't understand. And later she realized that that was his way of connecting and basically telling grandchildren, I love you, right? This is our quality time together. This is our bonding moment, right? And part of his planning was basically to say, when I'm gone, I want this to continue. Somebody, like, I'm not going to be in their lives anymore, but somebody's going to take them to 7-Eleven, every 2 weeks or every month or whatever, and keep that tradition alive, because that's how they are going to remember me. That's how they're going to remember the love that I shared with them, right? That's how that's the tradition that we had with grandpa. And so when grandpa's gone, maybe grandma or one of the uncles or somebody does that, but when every time they go, they remember grandpa. And that's an embedded message in those guidelines that you've left. That's a way for them to recall you every single time that happens, right? And there are any number of ways to be able to do that, but that would be part of your planning that you could put in place. Another thing that would be something to consider is what we call a care plan, right? Which is instructions where you say, okay, well, these are the things that I would want somebody to know if I'm not there to say it, right? So again, if you have young children, all those parenting decisions of, what time do I want my kids to go to bed? What kind of movies do I want them to watch? What age should they be before they start dating? What kind of college do I want them to go to? That I just recently had a conversation with one of our clients, and this was an older couple, and they had adopted their granddaughter because they never had any children themselves. It was a second marriage. They never had any children themselves, and the wife's daughter was in a bad spot when she had her kid, and she couldn't take care of her, and so they ended up adopting the baby, right? Well, this guy fell in love with the baby, and she was his life, right? And he was in construction, and he worked on a lot of projects that had asbestos, and he developed lung cancer, and so he was basically on his final days, right? And we're talking about what is what he's doing his estate plan. He's thinking about what's important to him that he wants to make sure is left behind, and so on. And one of the things he says is, I'm just going to miss being there for her, and she's going to take it really hard. I don't know what to do. And one of the things we talked about was, you have the opportunity to be able to leave a lot of those memories and those expressions to her, and to give the instructions of what you would want to have happen when you're gone. One of the most important things to them was, well, she goes to Catholic school. We want her to continue in Catholic school. We want her to, to be in that sort of environment, because we feel like that reflects, our values. And so that was something we wanted to put into a care plan of saying, okay, when we're gone, this is how we want that care provided to our, in this case, granddaughter, right? But it could be the same thing for yourself. we had one of our attorneys who had her grandmother went into a nursing home, and one day her grandma's really disturbed, and so she says, "Grandma, what's wrong?" And she says, "I'm scared." "Well, why are you scared, Grandma?" And she says, "Well, because I'm starting to forget things. I can't remember things the same way I used to, and I'm afraid that they're not going to let me watch my favorite show anymore, right? Or I'm afraid that they're going to move my room and I'm not going to be able to see the mountains out the window anymore. I'm afraid that they're not going to let me eat my favorite cake after dinner." And and those were the things that were bothering her. Those were the things that were important to her. So we could put into a care plan those instructions to make sure that those things are going to be carried out when she could no longer speak for herself, right? Those are the instructions that we want to leave behind. So those are some of the ideas of, leaving these expressions of love or these expressions of values so that they then inform and provide color to the guidelines that you've left. And the most important part, or at least the last piece of all this, is leaving your life stories, because then those life stories are going to tell them why these values are important to you. And so there's a lot of ways to do that. You can do that through, writing a journal and leaving those accounts, right? You can write your personal memoirs. There's a lot of, people think that you have to be rich and famous to write your life story, but let me tell you, life, reality is stranger than fiction, right? Truth is stranger than fiction. And I've met so many people with amazing stories in their lives that aren't necessarily rich and famous, but they have these really crazy stories that, that are fun to hear, right? It's, a lot of times they're like straight out of a movie, because where do they get ideas for movies? They get them from real life, right? And so, telling your life story, we have, one of our most precious possessions as a family is the memoirs, the book that my great grandpa wrote about his life, about his life story. And it wasn't anything spectacular, but it means a lot to us, right? Family pictures, photo books. Now more than ever, there's so many services and options to be able to do that sort of thing. Video histories. You can actually record yourself, and you can give messages to your family, or you can tell stories. And I remember sitting down with my one of my grandmas and having her just tell me story after story about when she immigrated to the United States, stories that I hadn't heard before, right? Amazing stories that, during my whole lifetime, I probably only got to hear them once from her, and we recorded it. And so that way we could share it, right? Um, and then again, in today's world, you have a digital legacy, a digital persona, and who knows what's the future is going to be like. But, when you pass away, your Facebook page doesn't necessarily get taken down right away. You may want all your, social media posts and everything else, you may want all those removed, or you may want them to continue. If you have a book and you have book rights, or you have, let's say, a blog, or you have like a YouTube channel that has a bunch of followers and it's generating income, you may want those things to continue when you're gone, because it will keep generating income for the family, right? And those are things to consider as part of your digital legacy that you leave behind after you're gone. So just a few things to kind of think about as we talk about multi-generational planning, legacy planning, and so on. And one of the things that we include with every single one of our plans is a method to be able to keep track of all of these important things, whether they're important documents or accounts and passwords, whether they're instructions and wishes for your final arrangements and so on and so forth, or maybe they're, stories of your life and videos and pictures and all those things, to have them all in one place that can easily be transferred to your loved ones, to your next generation, so that they can get access to those things as part of your overall planning. So that's a little bit about legacy planning.